Welcome to this presentation in which we'll be covering Chapter 9, which is entitled Introduction to Contracts and Agreement. So let's get started. Let's begin by talking about some vocabulary issues that relate to contracts. In this chapter and in the next several chapters that we'll be covering, we will have the word contract in virtually every slide, and as you're taking notes, you will be writing the word contract, maybe 50 times during a particular lecture. So my advice to you would be to do what legal professionals do. They don't write out the word contract every time because it's such a common word for legal professionals to use. Instead, they write a capital K. The K stands for kappa, which is the hard C sound in Greek. We usually think about law being all about Latin or something along those lines, and it is true that we don't have a lot of Greek in our law, but this is one example where we do have just a touch of Greek in our legal tradition. So again, it's your choice whether you want to use a K or not, but you'll see as I am writing things and referring to things, I may well use a K, and when I do, in most cases, it's going to refer to contract. So keep that in mind as we go forward. I may not remember to remind you about that little abbreviation. So if you would file that away so it will make sense to you when we get to those sections. Another thing that sometimes is surprising about contract law is that our rules can seem arbitrary. And they seem arbitrary for a very good reason. In many cases, they are arbitrary. My guess is that everyone in this room has taken a math course that has involved some discussion of rounding. So let's say we had the number 1.3, and we're supposed to round it to the nearest whole number. Well, most of us would know that we ought to round down when it is 0.3. So we're going to do 1. But if our number were instead 1.7 and we're supposed to round to the nearest whole number, most of us would round to 2. Those rules aren't arbitrary. They're good common sense. But when we get to 1.5, we are in an arbitrary situation because we're equidistant from the 1 as we are from the 2. There's no reason to prefer the 1 over the 2 or the 2 over 1. So you could imagine a system, I suppose, in which it was really left to the particular mathematician whether he rounds up or he rounds down. So it could be that either 1 or 2 would be considered an appropriate answer. But I'm sure you can see that there would be problems with that rule because let's say that you're submitting an answer to a math problem and there's a series of numbers and you're supposed to round each number individually. We know this is 1, this is 2, but whether you call this 1 or 2 is going to affect your final answer. If you round down, then your answer is going to be 4. If you round up, your answer is going to be 5. And so it's going to affect the outcome of your answer. If you happen to be a person who rounds down, but the instructor is someone who rounds up, the instructor is going to expect to see a 5. When he or she sees a 4, probably there's going to be a deduction. So it makes sense in this scenario for a mathematician to just have a rule that everybody knows, and it's inherently arbitrary. I mean, the mathematicians could have said, let's always round down when we're equidistant from the numbers that we're rounding, or let's always round up. There's really no logical reason to prefer one over the other, but they decided to round up. That's our standard, and as a result, this is now incorrect. Not because it's illogical or unmathematical, but just because we have a rule that's arbitrary, but everybody knows about, we all follow it so that we have consistent answers. And so the correct answer here is going to be 5. That's the same situation we have with contracts. There will be times in contract law where the particular practice we have is we do X. We could have done Y. Sure, absolutely. Y would have been an equally good choice. But we had to choose between X or Y because for the most part, it is more important that we have a rule. Because if we have a rule, then everybody participating in that contract has the opportunity to say, wait a second, that's the rule. So given that rule, how can I put myself in the best situation? And in many cases, the rule is flexible in that the parties, if they don't express a preference, the rule will step in and establish what the relationships are. But the parties usually can say, you know what, that's the rule, we don't like that rule, so we're going to pick our own rule. And as long as we're clear about the rule that we prefer, the default rule doesn't apply in our circumstances. So given that sense that the parties can arrange their affairs and draft other language in the contract, given the knowledge about the rule, it's more important to them to have a rule, even if it's not their preferred rule, than to have no rule at all, because if you don't have a rule at all, there's a certain level of uncertainty. If you leave it up to a judge, maybe he'll share your vision, maybe he'll share the other guy's vision. And so now you have the uncertainty. In the law, uncertainty is one of the worst things you can have. Uncertainty is going to result oftentimes in one party to a contract having a certain vision or a certain understanding and the other party having a different understanding. Well, as soon as they have different understandings, this opens up the possibility of dispute, it makes contractual breach more likely, and it makes litigation more likely. Litigation is expensive and time-consuming, so those are negatives. Now, when you have a situation where you have a rule, the parties may disagree with the rule. Maybe one disagrees, maybe both disagree. But when they both know what the rule is, all they can do is throw up their hand and say, I don't like that rule, but you know what? It's the rule. If I go to the judge, he's going to say, hey, Groover, that's the rule. You got to follow it. So there's no point in me running to the judge to complain about the rule. Maybe I should go to my legislature and complain there so the rule is changed. I mean, that may make sense. But the rule is the rule is the rule. And once I understand what it is, then I can arrange my affairs consistent with that. A really important rule, and this rule isn't arbitrary, but it's a very common rule that we'll see popping up lots of time over the next several chapters, is the idea that things have to be reasonable and objective. Or that's how the standard is. That's how courts will determine it. So let's imagine that Bob and Larry enter into a contract. Bob happens to be colorblind. He can't really tell the difference between blue and green. Larry doesn't know this about Bob. They've never discussed it. Maybe even Bob himself doesn't really understand that he's colorblind. Anyway, in his mind, he thinks that this right here is blue. It looks blue to him. And this is the color that he wants his car to be. Maybe a color that we might call seafoam green if we're Larry. Anyway, so Bob says to Larry, Larry, I'd like a blue, I understand that you've got a blue car and I'd like to buy it from you. Well, Larry is a car dealer and he's got many cars on his lot, but he only has one blue car at that time. So as soon as Larry hears that, he thinks, oh yeah, that blue car, it's been sitting a lot for a while. It's a pretty old car, got some problems, not really very fancy. Yeah, I'd like to kind of unload that. But Bob, when he says blue car, he actually means the seafoam green car, which is actually a late model car that's in very pristine condition. And the true blue car maybe would ordinarily sell for $8,000. But the seafoam green car on Larry's lot would usually sell for $15,000 on his lot. So Bob is talking about this car, even though Larry understands him to be talking about this car. And the point of confusion is that Bob is colorblind, that he doesn't know which one is which. Anyway, so they negotiate, and Bob offers to pay $8,000 for that blue car. Larry says, okay, that sounds pretty good. That's about where I would have priced that blue car. But of course, Bob is thinking this car. And so when Bob hears Larry say, yep, I'll do that deal, Bob is delighted. He had thought he was going to have to pay several thousand more. But, he's not one to question good providence. So he goes, okay, great deal. They shake hands, they write up the contract, and then now it's time for Bob to get the keys to his blue car. That he thinks is a blue car, I'm sorry. And so he is given the keys, and he walks out to the parking lot, and he puts the key in the ignition of the car that he thought he bought, and it doesn't fit. He goes back in and talks to Larry. He goes, hey, Larry, you gave me the wrong key. I went out to the parking lot, and it didn't fit. And Larry goes, oh, I'm sorry. Well, let's go out and see what the deal is. So Larry and Bob walk out, and the blue car and the green car are parked next to each other. And Larry takes the key from Bob and puts it into the key place of the true blue car, and it fits right in. He goes, hey, Bob, what's the problem? It seems to be working fine. And Bob says, well, that's not the car I bought. I bought the blue car right over here. And at that moment, Larry realizes the problem, that Bob can't distinguish blue from green. And so under those circumstances, you might be saying, well, who was reasonable? We know that in Bob's head, he was negotiating over this car, but Larry thought he was negotiating over this car. Larry had no reason to know that Bob was colorblind, and any reasonable person with normal vision would have known that this car is clearly blue and this car is absolutely green. Now, it doesn't mean that when Bob was saying that this car was blue, it doesn't mean that he was lying, but it wasn't reasonable under the circumstances. Bob should have known he was colorblind, and he should have said, wait a second, you know what, I got a problem distinguishing blue and green, so before we go farther, I want the Ford Taurus car out in the parking lot. This is the VIN number. This is the one I want to buy. And then Larry K. said, Bob, that's not blue, that's green. Oh, okay. So Bob was in a position to know his particular disability, and he was in a position to provide more information to clarify it. He didn't. He acted unreasonably. This doesn't make Bob a bad or evil person. It just makes him an unreasonable person under these circumstances. One of the things that we don't want to get into in contract laws, don't want to get into reading people's minds. The reason for that is that when we get into reading people's minds and trying to figure out motivations, and is this person telling the truth, or what was it smart what this person did, or did this person connect the dots in the right way? It's very difficult to really know what's going on in someone else's mind. I mean, we're not in there with that person. Sometimes it's difficult for the person himself or herself to know what's going on. So it's very difficult to prove those things. It's much easier to keep it about, well, what did he say? Okay, he called the car blue. Well, we know that this shade is not blue. So therefore, he had to have been talking about this car, not this car. We look at the words, we look at the actions. We don't look at the private thoughts of the person, and most of the time, because that is very hard to prove. And after all, Larry didn't have the luxury of being inside Bob's mind. Larry could only rely upon the words Bob said and the actions Bob took. A reasonable standard is an objective standard. You know, we all have our quirks, and I certainly have mine. Just ask my husband. He would be happy to tell you about several of them. Anyway, when we are looking at an objective standard, what we're doing is we're separating the person from his or her quirks. I'll give you an example. I do not like French fries. I like virtually any other kind of junk food. I'm not a health nut by any means, but the French fries, I find them very unpleasant to eat, and more than that, the smell of French fries turns my stomach, literally makes me kind of ill. I like baked potatoes. I like potato chips, but French fries are just pretty close to revolting to me. Okay, I recognize that most people do not have this experience with French fries. They think French fries taste and smell good. So I know that my reaction to French fries is quirky and it's subjective, but it's my experience. One day I went to a Long John Silver's. It was my son's favorite fast food place. And the Long John Silver's we went to pretty routinely would get our orders wrong, but it was the only Long John Silver's close by, and so usually we would check. Okay, let me make sure I got everything right. But this day, for whatever reason, I didn't check. So I got home and I discovered instead of extra hush puppies, they had given us French fries. Oh my gosh. I mean, it smelled so rank in our house with all of that French fry stuff. I just couldn't stand it. I had to throw it all away. I didn't even save the fish or the hush puppies because the smell was so nasty. It had seeped into all the other food. And so, to me, all that food was contaminated by that nasty smell of French fries. But most people, even people who might have preferred hush puppies to French fries, they get French fries instead of hush puppies. They might have thought, oh gosh, bummer, but they would have been fine with it. Maybe they wouldn't have eaten the French fries, or maybe they would have eaten some, just not liked it as well. It wouldn't have been seen as a big deal. For me, it messed up the whole meal, but it was garbage in my opinion. It was worse than garbage. It made our whole house smell afterwards, and so I'm spraying the stuff around here to get rid of that awful smell. It would not be reasonable for me to go back to Long John Silver's and say, I expect a full refund of my price because those French fries contaminated my whole meal. Because most people wouldn't have seen it that way. It wouldn't be reasonable for Long John Silver's to assume that was people's ordinary reaction. But let me present to you a different scenario. This time, instead of having French fries in my Long John Silver's thing, I instead, when I open up, I see live cockroaches crawling all over the food. Well, most people, a reasonable person, would be pretty disturbed by that. They're not going to be willing to eat any of the food, and they're probably going to call the health department or something about Long John Silver's. Under those circumstances, it would be objective and reasonable for me to return to that Long John Silver's and say, hey, look at this. This food is contaminated. No one would want to eat this food under these circumstances. So you can see how when we remove the quirks of the individual and just look at what a reasonable person says, and we use the term reasonable, we don't mean, there's an old saying in the law that says, everybody thinks he is reasonable. But we all have our quirks. We all have our areas that we're reasonable, but we all have those areas in which we're not reasonable. So the standard isn't what I think is reasonable, because most of us, for example, I think it's perfectly reasonable to find French fries nasty and revolting, because they are nasty and revolting to me. But I have had sufficient life experience that I recognize that my view is a minority view. And so I recognize that I am legally unreasonable in that area, even though I have no intention or really ability to change my reaction to French fries. So who is a reasonable person? Well, a reasonable person is a mythical person. It's not a particular person. It's not Bob. It's not Larry. It's not me. It's not you. It's this mythical person. It's kind of a conglomeration of kind of our whole culture, our whole civilization, so to speak. This person has average intelligence, average life experience, average education, just as the kind of the average of our culture, of our way of life. He or she is devoid of quirks and peculiarities and things along those lines. He's also a disinterested party. He isn't Larry and he isn't Bob, because after all, Larry has an agenda. If Larry's entering into a contract with Bob, Larry wants to get more stuff, right? And Bob has an agenda too. Bob wants to get more stuff. So you never want to make any of the parties to a particular contract their reasonable person standard, because it's going to be biased in favor of one side or the other. So you want to pick a reasonable person standard that is divorced from the particular party. So sometimes people think of the reasonable person as the fly on the wall, the person who has observed everything in the circumstance but doesn't have a dog in the fight, doesn't have any skin in the game, doesn't have an agenda, doesn't really care if Bob wins or Larry wins. So that's when we talk about reasonable person, we're looking at it. It's really important, if you haven't already made this connection, remember that reasonable means an objective standard. There will be a test question over this. If this doesn't make sense to you, if you don't see why it's an objective standard, please come see me. This is a really important concept, and you need to get it kind of nailed down. If you might want to listen to my presentation at this point one more time so you can get it all crystallized, but you do need to not just commit this to memory, but understand why a reasonable standard is an objective standard. It's not a subjective standard. So we're going to have two topics in this chapter. The one topic is going to be just a general introduction to contract law. This is our first chapter on contract law, so we're going to be getting some vocabulary out of the way. The second topic of this chapter is a discussion of the first element of contract law, which is agreement. If this were a whole contracts course, these two would definitely be in two separate chapters. But for the interest of, because this is just, contracts is just one topic, an important topic, but just one topic in our business law course, they have combined these two things into one chapter. And obviously they're connected, they're both about contract law, but there's a little bit of a disconnect, so to speak, between these topics. So we're going to be covering both of these topics in this one chapter. And we're going to first of all talk about this one. So we're going to focus on this one for a while. Then we're going to go to this one, and then we're going to return to this one. So we're going to start here, go here, and then return to here. So it'll be a little bit of a quirky journey. Okay, so what is a contract? And this is a definition. You can see it's in red, so you're responsible for it. And it's hard to imagine us having a contract test without having this definition appearing in some way, shape, or form. So you definitely want to work on this one. And as always, Quizlet is such a good tool for memorizing, learning vocabulary terms. So what is a contract? It's a promise or a set of promises. And we'll learn a little bit later in this chapter about when it's a single promise and when it's usually a set of promises. So that there's kind of two categories here that we'll break down in later on in the chapter. But we either have a promise or a set of promises for the breach of which the law gives a remedy, or the performance of which the law in some way recognizes a duty. This is a little bit circular because what basically this definition is saying is a contract is a promise that the courts will enforce. That's what they're saying. Well, gosh, what kind of promises will the court enforce? Well, contracts. What's a contract? A contract is a promise the court will enforce. You can see it's circular. You have to understand what a contract is to understand what the law will enforce. You have to understand what the law will enforce in order to understand a contract. The reason for this is that really basic concepts are almost impossible to define. If I were to ask you, define the word "the," you'd be like, what? I don't know. I don't know how to define that. And even if we were to turn to, the Webster Dictionary and look up the word "the definition that would be included there would be using all kinds of long and hard words. That the reality is, if you don't know what the word "the" means, you're not going to understand the Merriam-Webster Dictionary definition of "we." So it's such a basic unit of speech that you have to understand that on some level in order to understand all the other pieces. And it's you get to the problem. It's almost like an atom. You can't really get into a smaller unit than an atom. Okay, so So this is what the definition of a contract is. And so it's a little bit hopeless in terms of using a definition, but we aren't lost because we've got a different way of looking at contracts. And we're going to look at it from the perspective of elements. We'll talk about what an element is in just a second. So let's bookmark this concept, but let's look at the 4 things we have going on in a contract. A contract has to include an agreement. A contract has to include consideration. A contract has to include contractual capacity, and it also has to include legal object. Let me flip back here because we'll see that our second topic in this chapter is about agreement. So here we have. So we're going to cover an introduction to contracts, and then we'll be having discussion of the first of the 4 elements of a contract, the agreement. So we'll be talking generally about contracts and then very specifically and in more detail about this particular part. So we'll touch on everything on this slide, but this one will do a lot more depth. It's important that you understand these elements. I'm actually going to step away from this for a second and take you to a document here. This is that same information that we were just talking about. A contract has 4 elements. You will definitely see this on a test question. So you will want to know all 4 of these elements. The order isn't important, but you need to know this. If you've learned about contract law through some other resource, it's possible you've seen this data presented in a somewhat different mechanism. There's a few different ways of looking at this, but this is the way our textbook presents the data. And it's a smart way of doing it. I would say it's the most common way of breaking down the requirements for a contract. So when I say what are the 4 elements, this is what you're going to list. There may be other things you could list, but if I don't see these 4 things, you're going to be missing points. So it behooves you to learn these 4 elements as your elements of contract law, so you'll be most successful on the test. Okay, so remember this list, and we'll be referring to it many, many times over the course of the next several chapters. Let's go to the next slide. So what is an element? If you've taken chemistry, and I imagine most folks have, you have heard the term element before. Hydrogen's an element, carbon's an element, nitrogen and oxygen are elements. These are basic units of matter that are can't be broken down into further basic units. So we know what water is. Water is H2O. 2 elements of hydrogen, 1 element of oxygen. Those combined together gives us water. So water isn't an element, but it's made up of 2 elements, or actually 3 elements, but 2 ingredients. If I only have oxygen, I can't make water. If I only have hydrogen, I can't make water. If I have only 1 hydrogen and 1 oxygen, I can't make water. But if I have 2 elements of hydrogen and 1 element of oxygen, I can make water. That's the equation. That's the formula. That's the recipe for water. And so these are, when we say element, these are the required things we need in order to build, in this case, water. Well, these are the required things we need for contracts. Let's look at this from a different perspective. Let's assume, let's talk about here from a definition from the periodic table. And this one is not a required definition. You don't have to memorize this, but it can, depending upon your particular background, this may be a helpful way of thinking about it. An element from the periodic table is each of more than 100 substances that cannot be chemically interconverted or broken down into simpler substances and are primary constituents of matter. So these are the simplest pieces, the building blocks, so to speak. Our definition of element is going to be a little bit different. It is a part or aspect of something abstract, especially one that is essential or characteristic. The idea of a contract is kind of inherently abstract. You can't touch a contract. I mean, obviously you can reduce a contract into writing, but the idea of contract is not a touchable thing. And so when we talk about elements, we're talking about the tangible things or the characteristics that allow us to conceptualize that idea. An important idea here is that elements are essential. You have to have all the elements. If I'm missing one, if I'm going back here, if I'm missing contractual capacity, I don't have a contract. If I'm missing agreement, I don't have a contract. If I'm missing consideration, I don't have a contract. If I'm missing legal object, I don't have a contract. I may have something, it may even have legal significance, but it's not a contract. So these we have to have. We may have other stuff, but it's possible that we can have these 4 items and additional stuff. That's not going to make it not a contract, usually, but we have to have at least this. These are necessary and sufficient elements for most contracts. Let's think about it from another perspective. Let's say you're a little bit, science isn't your thing, and maybe law isn't your preferred topic either, but let's say you like to bake. Well, the same idea of elements exists in a recipe. Let's say I want to bake sugar cookies. Well, there are certain elements or ingredients I have to have. I'm going to need some type of flour. I mean, it wouldn't have to be a wheat flour. It might be a rice flour or some other type of flour. I'm going to need to have eggs. It's hard for me to imagine a sugar cookie recipe without eggs or some kind of egg substitute. I'm going to need to have sugar. Obviously, it's called a sugar cookie. Can't make sugar cookies without having sugar. I'm going to need to have butter or some equivalent. Maybe I'm going to use a margarine or some other type of oil for that effect. But I'm going to need something along those lines. And I'm going to need a leavening agent. Maybe it's baking soda, maybe it's baking powder, something along those lines. I'm going to need these. And we can see here that I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements. But again, I might have additional things. I might want to have some jimmies or some sprinkles on my cookies. I might want some food coloring. I might want some vanilla. I can add those to my sugar cookies, and it doesn't make them not sugar cookies, but they're not a requirement. I can have a sugar cookie without any sprinkles, without any frosting, without any pink or yellow or blue, even without vanilla, although it might not taste as good. But we're not saying the most delicious sugar cookies. That's not our definition. Our definition is, would it be a sugar cookie? Would it meet the definition of sugar cookie? And so when we're talking about elements, you can think about it as a recipe. So going back to our recipe here, these are our ingredients, our recipe for a contract. We have to have all of these things in order to have a contract. Okay, so we're going to look at some common contractual terms now. We've already done a few when we were looking at the idea of contract law. So we've kind of checked off one. We have a kind of our first defined term, but let's expand our vocabulary a little bit. One is the idea of consideration. Well, we've already seen this word before. We have it right here. So we're going to learn a little bit more about what we mean when we use this word consideration. Let's see. I mean, obviously it's important to see what all these 4 things are, like when we're doing the recipe for sugar cookies. If we don't know what sugar is, it's going to be hard for us to make the sugar cookie recipe, because how do you find an ingredient that you don't know what it looks like? I might be rummaging through my freezer or my refrigerator looking for the sugar. Sugar's not going to be in there. Or if I'm looking for butter, I might look in my pantry instead of my refrigerator. I'm probably not going to find it in my pantry if I'm looking for butter. So knowing what it is going to help us make more sense out of these ingredients or these elements. So what is consideration? This is the definition of consideration for this course. It is the bargain for exchange. Many books will include a dash here because this is really acting as an adjective. What type of exchange is it? It's bargained for. It is the bargain for exchange. It is what each party gets in exchange for his or her promise under a contract. My guess is that before you saw this slide or read the chapter in the textbook, you thought about the word consideration in a different context. When we use the term consideration, we probably use it more like Eeyore here. A little consideration, a little thought for others makes all the difference. So when I say show me some consideration, I probably don't mean show me a bargain for exchange. No, what I mean is show me some compassion. Think about my feelings. Cut me some slack. That's what I probably mean. So you can see in everyday conversation, the word consideration has a fairly different meaning than the way we use it in the law. But there is some connection between the two. Consideration in the everyday meaning of the way Eeyore means, in other words, means that you should consider the other person's feelings, right? So you can see in consideration the emphasis upon being thoughtful for the other person. In the legal perspective, we also look to the word consider. But here we're saying consider the deal. What am I getting out of this deal? Oh, I'm getting out of this deal this thing from the other guy. He's giving me something and I'm giving him something. And so I'm going to consider what I'm going to give him, and I'm going to consider what I'm going to get from him. And that tit for tat, that quid pro quo, is what I'm considering when I decide whether to enter into the contract or not. So you can see that the two ideas have some connection, even though it's a little bit attenuated. So that's what consideration is. We have a whole chapter about consideration, so I'm just really introducing the beginning part of it. So that is what consideration is. But let's go on to our next item, contractual capacity. When I hear the word capacity, I think of going to the grocery store and buying a gallon of milk. And I think, well, how much is this container going to hold? What's its capacity? Will it hold half a gallon, 2 liters? I mean, what's the measurement there? And so when I think capacity, I think of kind of size, volume, that idea. But that's not how we're using it in this context. We're using it a little bit differently. We're using capacity to mean capable. And of course, there's a connection between the gallon container because it's capable of holding a gallon of milk, right? That's its size. It's also capable of holding half a gallon of milk. Obviously, if it can hold a gallon, it can hold half a gallon. But we aren't thinking about capacity or being capable from the perspective of volume in the legal context. We're talking about contractual capacity. We're talking about the legal ability or capability of entering into a binding contract. We again have a significant section on this. This will share a chapter with legal objects. So these will be together. This will be its own chapter going forward. There's several impediments to having capacity, but the two that are most important legally are minority and insanity. I think the term insanity is probably pretty clear. When somebody is insane, they lack the ability to process the data that they're receiving through their senses. We use the term insanity to refer to contractual incapacity, but we're using this term fairly narrowly. A person might have a serious mental illness, but they may still be able to distinguish between reality and non-reality. They may still be able to make reasonably wise decisions. Perhaps they're very depressed, but they know what money is, they know what contracts are, they know when they enter into a contract what type of obligations they're assuming. So under those sorts of situations, we might call that very depressed person somebody who is severely mentally ill, but we wouldn't necessarily say that they are insane because they would have legal capacity under those circumstances because they understand what they're doing. The point I'm trying to make is that the bar for legal capacity is very low. Lots of people who are pretty messed up can still enter into a legally binding contract. Now let's talk about the idea of minority. Minority in everyday conversation, at least how we use it in the United States, usually refers to groups that are not represented as being very numerous. For example, I might be a minority if I am left-handed. I might be a minority if I'm African American or Asian or Hispanic, because my particular group makes up less than 50% of the larger group. I might be a minority if I have diabetes, or if I am under the influence of alcohol. I'm a minority because most people are sober. So that's how we ordinarily use the word minority in everyday conversation. We mean less than 50%. That's not what I mean here. This has nothing to do with ethnicity or being a member of a group that doesn't make up the at least 50% of the population. Here we mean somebody under the age of 18. They are a minor. And when we refer to somebody in their majority, we mean somebody 18 and older. Now, we've all known people under the age of 18 who are very sophisticated. Maybe they day trade. Maybe they have been employed for several years. They're perhaps a successful business person. They may have a lot of sophistication about contracts. But the law doesn't really distinguish. The law doesn't say, well, that person's only 17, but they're very sophisticated about this, so we're going to enforce their contracts. No. Minority/majority is an on-off switch. You know, at 12:01 a.m. on your 18th birthday, you gained your majority. You weren't magically made wiser, more mature, having more judgment and more knowledge about the world than you were 2 minutes before when you were 17. But the law says we've got to have some date. It's arbitrary. But it's at the standard that we're going to establish. You may recall we talked about arbitrary before. So we could say, you know, the rule 18 is an arbitrary rule. Some people will be ready for contractual responsibilities at 16 or even 15. Honestly, there are some, you know, slow learners out there who might not be ready for it until they're 21 or even 25. But we have to have one number, or we don't have to, but it makes life a lot easier to have one magic number that's going to be, you know, approximately right. Would it have been crazy if we had picked 19? No. And in fact, for a long time, the standard was 21. And that, again, was arbitrary, but it worked just fine. So there's something in that age category is what we're looking at. Now we have the age of 18. It's arbitrary, but as soon as we know what the rule is, we can get our behavior in line with that rule. So that's what minority is. I will invariably have a student at some point who thinks, when I say something like, you can't be in your minority and enter into a contract, and they will think, oh, that's racist. I can be a minority and enter into a contract. Well, of course, you can be a member of any ethnic group and enter into a contract, but you can't enter into a contract until you're 18. So when you are in your minority, you lack contractual capacity. We'll talk more about this topic as we make progress into a later chapter. So now let's go back to our 4 elements. We haven't talked really about agreement because that's our second topic for this chapter. We've talked a little bit about consideration, a little bit about a contractual capacity. Now we're going to talk about legal object. This term is probably the most straightforward of our terms in terms of how we would use this term in everyday conversation. A legal object is the requirement that the contract does not violate a statute or public policy. I think this is pretty intuitive. I think we all know that if I enter into a contract to sell Bob heroin, and I deliver the heroin to Bob, and Bob writes me a check that bounces, I can't sue him over that. You don't have to be very sophisticated at all to recognize that the court is not going to enforce a contract to buy heroin because it violates a statute as well as a public policy. And so a contract has to have a lawful object. If it's a contract to sell unlawful drugs, or maybe it's a gambling contract in a jurisdiction that does not permit that type of gambling, or perhaps it's selling a kidney, or it's prostitution or something like that. No matter how many I's are dotted correctly and T's are crossed correctly, no matter whether everything else is present, if we don't have a legal object, the courts are not going to enforce that contract. Okay, so we've gone through very briefly 3 of the 4 elements to a contract. We've kind of touched a little bit on some introduction to contract law. We're going to return to this topic later on in this chapter, but now we're going to switch from this down here to that first element of our agreement, of our contract, the agreement requirement. Don't worry, we're going to come back to this right now, but we're going to cover the agreement topic next. So let's continue on. Okay, so we've talked about the idea of an agreement, or we haven't yet, but we're about to talk about the idea of an agreement. What is an agreement? An agreement is one of the 4 elements of a contract. Okay, we already know that. It consists of an offer made by one party, the offeror, that's the name of the person making the offer, and the acceptance of the offer by another party, the offeree. That's the person who receives the offer. So really, this is just a way of describing this particular situation. So an agreement is an element of a contract, but an agreement has 2 sub-elements, an offer and an acceptance. If you just have an offer, no acceptance, you don't have an agreement. If you don't have an agreement, you don't have a contract. So you need to have you need to have both an offer and an acceptance. Remember before I said that when I asked for the 4 elements on test questions, sometimes students miss this one. In fact, it's a pretty common one to miss. Well, what they might say, a pretty common thing they'll say is they'll say that the 4 elements are agreement, comma, offer, comma, acceptance, comma, and they say consideration. Well, an agreement is an element and consideration is an element. But offer and acceptance are sub-elements of agreement. They have missed these other 2 elements. I usually don't object when somebody adds elements. So if the student had said, well, I think there are 6 elements to contracts: agreement, offer, acceptance, consideration, contractual capacity, and legal object. If you list all 6, okay, maybe not the best, but close enough. But what I'm most concerned about is when you leave items off. So be careful. Whenever you're doing a list of elements of contract, you have to have all 4 of these. So let's go back and talk more about agreement. So we know we need to have an offer and acceptance. If we just have an offer but no acceptance, we don't have an agreement, and therefore we don't have a contract. If we somehow have an acceptance without an offer, we don't have an agreement, and therefore we don't have a contract. So going back to our schema that we talked about before, now we have a little bit more granularity in this. We still need to have our 4 elements: agreement, consideration, contractual capacity, and legal object. But now under agreement, we know some more about what do we mean when we say agreement. It needs to have an offer and we need to have an acceptance. And just a little bit of a review here. So going to our next page, here we go. Yes, so here is that same representation. Again, we're just getting more granular, we're providing more details. I like to think about this as kind of like an outline. And so we start out with kind of the bare bones, the big topics, and under each one of these topics, we're going to add more data to it over the course of the semester. And so at the end, when we get to the final element, when we finish legal object, we'll have an outline of contract law, which is pretty robust. It will be a good outline for you to use in part to study. It won't include everything, but it includes some important parts of what you'll want to study for the test that we'll be having. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So now we have to talk about, well, what do we mean by offer and acceptance? Okay, we know we need to have them, but what do those terms mean? Well, for the most part, they mean what we think they mean. They mean the same thing that we mean in everyday conversation. An offer consists of the terms and conditions set by the offeror and present to another party, the offeree. Okay, so it's what the deal is. So when I say to Bob, Bob, I'm willing to sell you my, I have a bakery, and I'm willing to sell you this 8-inch pecan pie for $17. Well, those, if you will, pay me now and take the pie now. At this moment, complete the transaction right now. Those would be the terms and conditions of my offer. I would be the offeror because I'm setting the terms and conditions, and Bob would be the offeree. I am presenting these terms and conditions to Bob and saying, hey Bob, I'm willing to do this deal with you. The person behind Bob in line at my bakery, we'll say it's Teresa, may not get that same offer. Maybe I like Bob better than Teresa, or maybe I like Teresa better than Bob, or maybe this is my last pecan pie, and if Bob buys it, there won't be one available for Teresa to buy. So it's important to know who that particular offeree is going to be. So we know the idea, we get the concept of what an offer is, and we also get who the offeror is, the person making the offer. And the offeree is the person who's receiving the offer. I know we've talked about this before, but let's just do a little bit of a refresher when we see these OR and EE endings, because they can be a little bit confusing. In the law, we have a lot of words that end OR. And in the example offeror, we see the OR ending. The offeror is the person doing or making the offer. Many times in everyday English, instead of saying OR, we use ER. For example, if I were to have the word writer here, we all immediately recognize that a person who is the writer is the person who makes or does a writing. That's how that works. But in the law, we usually don't use the ER ending. We usually make it an OR ending. Let's look at the EE suffix. It works like this. The EE suffix, if we lop that off, this is the person who receives whatever the word before is it there, the base before it. So the offeree receives the offer. We can see that in English with the term invitee. If I get an invitation to Bob's wedding, I am an invitee. I am somebody who receives an invitation. So that's how it works. So we actually have these terms or something similar to this in everyday conversation. It's an important pattern to be aware of because we'll be seeing this pattern many, many times in the coming chapters as we have in other chapters. Okay, so now we're going to drill down a little bit more into what an offer is. An offer actually has 3 elements. So we've talked about how every contract has to include an agreement, and every agreement has to include an offer. And now we're going to talk about the 3 things that each offer has to have, so we can get kind of more and more granular. You know, if you think about it from the perspective of you know, say science, we might talk about all animals, and then we break that down into mammals, and then we break it down farther to say great apes, and then we maybe break that farther to say Homo sapiens. You can see how we can get more and more detailed, more and more specific about those particular categories. Well, that's what we're doing here as we drill down on these terms. So in order to have something that's an offer, it has to have these 3 things. And again, we have the word elements here. So if it's missing any one of these 3 things, if an offer only has 2 of these 3, it isn't an offer. If it's not an offer, we don't have an agreement. If we don't have an agreement, we don't have a contract. So just one little bit failing causes the whole thing to go belly up. The way I like to think about elements is imagine that I'm making a soup. I have put in potatoes and corn and beans and zucchini and onions and tomatoes, and it's just delicious, rich broth, lots and lots of awesome flavor. I've added some um, meat to it, so it's nice and hearty. The smell of it is amazing. It's so nutritious and healthful. Anyway, I'm about to serve it up, and everybody's kind of excited, and it's a uh, big vat of soup. I mean, it would feed probably 20 people. And right before I serve it, I called everyone and go, hey, you know what? I think I have one more ingredient that's going to make this soup really special. I'm going to put just 1 teaspoon of rat poison in. And so I take the rat poison and I put 1 teaspoon in, I stir it up. Oh, it still smells so good. And it's bubbling and it's hot and all those veggies just look so tasty. And so I spoon up the soup into soup bowls and I distribute it, and everybody looks at their soup and they can smell how good it smells. But no one tastes the soup, because guess what? One little element being off is enough to destroy the whole soup. It's not something they want to eat. Just a little bit of rat poison is enough to make someone say, I don't want that. Similarly, just being a little bit off on our offer is going to make it not an offer, which means we don't have an offer, which means we don't have an agreement, which means we don't have a contract. So let's see what the requirements for offer are. The first is that the offeror must manifest an intent to be bound by the offeree's acceptance. And again, here is going to be an objective standard. So we're not focusing upon what's going on in the dark recesses of the offeror's mind, the quirks that exist in his or her mind, whether he or she is, has some weird aversion to French fries, or whether he might be colorblind or some other peculiarity about that person. We're not interested in that. We're just assuming this is a garden variety, reasonable person. Then we're going to look at the terms of the offer. They have to be definite and certain. And finally, we're going to see the offer has to be communicated to the offeree, or at least to the offeree's agent. So let's look at our more granular description of offer. So we have all of these elements in here. We now don't have just offer and acceptance under the title agreement, but we also have what we mean by offer. So let's flip on over for a second to our next slide. And we have all of these new items on here. So basically what I've done is just taken from the PowerPoint slide and put them into this Word document. And we have these more granularity under offer. But what we're going to do is we're going to go through each one of these 3 elements of offer and figure out what they actually mean. Okay, so let me make this a little bit bigger here. And here what I've done is I've taken and put in italics that first requirement from the slide before. So we're looking at this element right here. So the offeror must manifest an intent to be bound by the offeree's acceptance, which is an objective standard. First thing we have to contend with is this word intent. What do we mean by intent? Well, intent is the intended purpose or goal of an action, especially in a contract. Okay, well, I'm sure you saw it. It's circular because, of course, intend is just a different way of saying intent. So it's a little bit like saying red is a reddish color, or blue is a bluish color. Doesn't really give me any additional information. It's circular. But again, it's circular because it's such a basic concept, we really can't define it very easily. So we're going to look at some things that maybe help us get a little bit farther down the road on this. Let's look at some things that aren't considered offers, and they aren't considered offers because that intent is lacking. For example, an invitation to negotiate isn't an offer because the person who has extended this invitation to negotiate did not intend to create a contract, did not intend that what he is saying is sufficiently precise that the offeree can accept it at that point. So for example, we'll go back to the story of Bob and Larry. This time Bob is not colorblind. Bob comes into the car dealership and he starts saying, you know, I'm kind of interested in that. We'll say he now, since he has good vision, I'm kind of interested in that seafoam green car out there. Boy, I have some questions about it. What's the odometer reading on it? How old are those tires? What kind of engine work has been done on it? I'd like to give it a test drive. And so he has a lot of questions. That's part of that negotiation process. And you might say things, you know, it's really important to me that the air conditioning works really well, so I'm going to want you to put more Freon in that air conditioning unit. Or, you know, if I buy this car, I'm going to want a nicer radio than what you have in that car. So I'm going to need you to switch out the radio from the component that's in there right now to a nicer component that's going to give me these particular features. I'm going to want to have Blu-ray so I can put my cell phone uh, uh, speaker through that car audio system. So so again, we're talking about things he's going to want, and he might say things like, you know, I think I'm probably going to want to pay cash for the car, but it's going to turn apart on what price we end up with. If we end up with a relatively low price, I can pay cash. If we're at a higher price, you know, I may need to pay finance it. All of these are invitations to negotiate. They aren't precise enough to be offers. And it's pretty obvious that Bob would be taken aback if Larry were to say, I accept your offer, but I didn't give you an offer. We haven't even talked about price yet. Would be Bob's reaction, right? Because there hasn't been enough information for there to be anything to accept. So under those circumstances, we haven't satisfied that first element of offer. But it could be that we actually do start talking about money. It might be something like this. You know, once I test drive this car, I mean, assuming that it rides really well, I might be willing to pay about $12,000 for it. Now that sounds more like an offer than the earlier things that I said, but it's still not an offer because he's saying, I'm going to need to do this first. And once I do this, it's possible that I'm going to extend an offer for that amount, but it's also possible I'm not. And so if Larry were to say, I accept your offer, I'll be like, I haven't made an offer. I haven't given it a test drive. I might ride the car and say, oh, definitely don't want this car. And so, you know, we're not to the point that we've gotten to an offer. An invitation to negotiate qualifies as preliminary negotiations. We haven't gotten to the point that we are at negotiations. So there can be a give and take. Bob might say, you know, if you put in a nicer stereo and put 4 new tires on, you know, I'd probably be talking in the neighborhood of $12,000, $13,000. That still is preliminary negotiations. We're farther down the road. He's decided he likes the way it drives, but we're not to the point of everything is being locked down yet. In this category of invitations to negotiate are most advertisements. Most advertisements fall into this category. Usually they don't talk that much about price. Think about maybe when you've seen an advertisement for McDonald's. They put a lot of emphasis upon showing you the burger or having a wonderful experience at the McDonald's, but many times they don't actually tell you what the price is going to be. Sometimes they don't include the price because it may vary from market to market. Maybe if you're buying a Big Mac in Manhattan, it costs more than if you're buying a Big Mac in Frisco. It might also be that they might want to run this advertisement for a while, and they might see that the price structure changes over time. or they may just not think that price is the message, the particular message they want to convey in this particular advertisement. So advertisements that don't nail down all the specifics are not going to be considered offers because they're not detailed enough to be actually something that the person who is broadcasting the advertisement intended to be bound by. There are some exceptions to this, though. You may notice that I use the word most here. And I guess the use of the word most suggests that sometimes advertisements can be considered offers. Our textbook talks about such an example, and that example is Lefkowitz versus Great Minneapolis Surplus Store Incorporated. This particular case is available to you in the module. There's a little video and a case summary that will help fill in the details. I'm not going to go into a great deal of depth on this particular case. I'm just going to touch on a couple of high points on it. The first two things to notice is that this is a Minnesota state case. That's where we have the Minnesota, back from 1957. So pretty long time ago, and from a state pretty far from us. So this is a bit of a quirky decision. I like the opinion. It's a kind of a fun case, but it's not representative of a very common situation because it actually establishes the reverse rule. In this case, the court found that Great Minneapolis Surplus Store's advertisement was an offer. So it's not the usual rule, it's the exception because the actual advertisement was so detailed. In this case, Mr. Lefkowitz saw an advertisement in the newspaper offering to sell, I think it was a mink coat or mink coats to the first few customers at a very low price. Well, Mr. Lefkowitz thought, all righty, I'll be down there first in line and I will buy one of these very inexpensive mink coats. And that's what he did. He got into line, got there very early in the morning. He was in line when the store opened. He was one of the first people in line. And when he got to the beginning, the front of the line, he says, I want one of those mink coats from the advertisements. Well, the salesperson said, well, you're not eligible for this because you're a man. This ad was just for women. Mr. Lefkowitz pulls out the ad and goes, well, where does it say anything about being a woman? There's nothing in the ad that restricts the offer to women. And then the salesperson said, well, yeah, that's true, but these are women's mink coats, so we assumed it would be women who would come in here to buy this, so you aren't who we intended to offer. Mr. Lefkowitz's point was, well, you didn't exclude me from the offer, and it's a very detailed offer establishing the price and the characteristics of the mink coats that you were willing to sell. But he left dissatisfied. He was not able to buy the mink coat at the reduced price. The Great Minneapolis Surplus Store ran that same ad a little while later, and Mr. Lefkowitz did the same thing. He showed up. He was near the front of the line. He tried to buy it, and he was denied. So then he sued, saying, I accepted an offer. I was willing to provide the consideration of paying for the coat. I had legal capacity. I was over the age of 18, probably 21 back then, but whatever the age was. And it was a legally permitted type contract. So we did have a contract. Great Minneapolis Surplus Store breached the contract by not allowing me to have the mink coat. And Mr. Lefkowitz won. Again, this is not the usual case. Most advertisements will be considered simply invitations to negotiate. This is an outlier. Okay, let's talk about another category of advertisements. These are bait and switch advertisements. We talk about this in the consumer law section. This is when a company, a seller, retailer, runs an ad provides a very low price for a particular item, but usually has only a few of those. And the goal is that when consumers see that this popular item is being offered at a very low price, they will come into the store. But many more people will come in than the store has those items available. And so when most customers come in, they will be too late to actually buy the bait. The supply will be gone. And so then the store will try to switch those customers to another item. And so obviously many customers will leave and say, I don't want that other item, I'm leaving. But some customers probably will say, wait a second, I wanted the bait, but the bait's not available. I need something like the bait, so I'll go ahead and switch. It can be that these types of transactions are unlawful. It depends upon lots of factors. How many of the bait were available? Did the advertisement include language like while supplies last, or limited quantities, or no rain checks, or things along those lines, or not? And so those can be factors. The Federal Trade Commission is the federal agency that is involved in bait and switch advertising. Now, bait and switch advertising can qualify as legal offers, but when we're looking at bait and switch advertising, the question really isn't, was there a contract that was accepted? The question is more, did it violate the relevant federal law? And so this issue really doesn't have to do directly with contract law formation. So it's a little bit of a related, but not directly on point topic. Let's look at the topic of an auction with reserve. We'll talk more about auctions with and without reserve later on, but let me first of all introduce these terms to you. An auction can be with or without reserve. Imagine that I have a Monet painting. It's been appraised for $20 million. I'm selling it, and we're at, say, at Christie's or Sotheby's, and so there's all these art dealers in the audience, and we begin bidding. Bob is the first to bid, and he says $10. Sally raises her little card and says $15. Larry raises his card and says $20. For whatever reason, nobody else in the room bids. And Larry buys this ridiculously expensive Monet, or should have been ridiculously expensive Monet, for only $20. That would be an example of an auction without reserve. It had no minimum price because the auctioneer accepted bids as low as $1. An auction with reserve provides a floor. Only bids at or above that floor will be considered. So let's imagine what an auction with reserve is. Let's say that this Monet is appraised at $20 million. So the auction with reserve might provide that bids will start to be accepted at $15 million. So this time Bob says $10. The auctioneer says, I'm sorry, sir, this is an auction with reserve. I am not accepting bids below $15 million. Then Bob says $15 million. Thank you, sir. That bid is accepted. Then Sally says $15 million and $10. $15 million, $10. And so now the bid is $15 million, $10. And now Larry says $15 million, $15. And let's say that's where the bidding stops. Well, that is going to be the price that it is purchased at. Even though there is a floor with an auction with reserve, the owner is not making an offer. It's the bidder who makes the offer. The owner is accepting the offer made by the bidder. A joke is not an offer. Sometimes circumstances happen, many times they're drinking related, where people say something that they don't really mean. Maybe they're making a point, or they're engaging in hyperbole. For example, I might say, let's say I've had a really bad day at work, and on my way home from work, I get a flat tire, and it's on 75. And I managed to get onto the shoulder, but cars are whizzing by. It's raining. It's just an awful day. I get out of my car. I put my car up on the jack. I switched the tire out. I was wearing a suit. I've got mud on my suit. It's just awful, awful, awful day. And you know what? Just 2 weeks earlier, I'd had another incidents where I got a flat tire on the same stretch of road. And I'm just so angry and so tired and so frustrated. Anyway, I eventually, I was actually going to a bar to meet some friends. I get to the bar, I'm an hour late. I look awful. I come in, everyone's like, "What happened? What happened?" And I explain. And I say, as I'm venting to my friends, "You know what? If someone will just buy me a drink, you can just have this car. I hate this car." And one of my friends says, "Okay, what drink would you like?" I go, I need a daiquiri right now." Okay, so uh, my friend orders me a daiquiri, pays for the daiquiri, hands me the daiquiri, and says, "Okay, here you go. I hope this daiquiri makes you feel better. Do you have the title to your car with you so you can just sign it over right here?" You go, "What? What do you mean?" "Well, you said that if I bought you your drink, that you would let me have your car. I know you're frustrated with your car, but your car's value probably be at least $12,000. Your daiquiri costs $10, so I just made a nice profit." Well, I would probably at that moment say, "But I was making a joke. I didn't mean it literally." And you know what? A reasonable person under those circumstances would have understood that I didn't mean it literally, that I was trying to make a point. I was trying to say, "I'm so frustrated." And I just used kind of contract language to communicate that frustration. What would the fly on the wall think? What would a reasonable person have thought? Given the fact that I was wet and muddy and expressing frustration and all of that stuff to my friends, would communicate to most people that I really didn't intend to sell my car. But let's imagine another scenario. This time I've had all of the same repercussions, but before I actually go to the restaurant, I change clothes. I go home, I get into clothes, I dry myself off, then I drive to the restaurant and I go in and I had called my friends and saying, "Oh, I'm running late, I'll be there, about an hour or so." They go, "Okay, fine." I sound calm, cool, and collected. I come into the store and I go, "You know what? I'd I'd really like a daiquiri right now. Um, Look, I'll tell you what, and this sounds weird, but I'll tell you what, if someone would buy me a daiquiri, I would be willing to sign over the title to my car. Um, that just, it feels like what I want to do right now." Somebody there says, "Oh, here, I'll accept that." That might seem like a weird contract for me to enter into, but I haven't told them the story of my frustration. I'm not acting angry or upset. I'm not obviously in distress. And so, under those circumstances, it's possible that a court might say that a reasonable person would think that I meant it, that maybe I was just trying to help out my friends. Maybe my friend who I'm making this offer to has hit some bad times financially. This might be a way of me helping them out by giving them essentially a free car. Or maybe I'm just a very wealthy person and you know what, I just go through cars like other people go through tissues. And so it could be that that offer isn't a joke, or a reasonable person wouldn't have interpreted it to be a joke. And again, what's going on subjectively in my head isn't relevant if other people can't see evidence of it or know what's going on inside of my head. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our second element. Let's go back and look here. We've talked about the first element, which is the offer must manifest an intent to be bound by the offeree's acceptance. And of course, this is an objective standard, not a subjective standard. Now we're going to go on to our second element of an offer, and that is that the terms of the offer must be definite and certain. The terms of the offer must be definite and certain. All material terms must be addressed. And so now we have our term material. What does it mean? Material means important, essential, relevant. It doesn't mean this. We're not talking about cloth. Now, obviously, the material that the sofa is made in is essential to a contract about buying a sofa or a dress or whatever you're buying. But we don't, when we're using the term material in the law, we're not discussing fabric usually. So you can say the material terms to a contract to build a building. Well, there's no fabric involved in building a building, so we're using material in a different situation. If one of the elements of the deal is missing from the offer, then we don't have an offer. So we have to make sure that we have them covered. And usually when we're looking at what are these essential elements, we're going to need to have a description of the offer or the service. If that's missing, we're missing a material element, so we don't have something that is definite and certain. If we don't have something that's definite and certain, we don't have an offer. If we don't have an offer, we don't have an agreement. If we don't have an agreement, we don't have a contract. But there could be other things that are missing. It might not be the description that's missing, it might be the quantity that's missing, or the price that's missing, or the time or the method of delivery may be missing. Any one of those missing will mean that a material term is missing, so we haven't satisfied our second element of the offer, so we don't have an offer, we don't have an agreement, we don't have a contract. Let's look at the third and the last element of the offer. So we've talked about the terms of the offer must be definite and certain. Now we're down here to the offer must be communicated to the offeree or the offeree's agent. This is a pretty unusual one not to satisfy. I can communicate it to the offeree in any way I want to. I can yell it to the person, I can whisper it to the person, I can email the person, I can text the person, I can write the person a letter, I can call the person over the telephone, I can send the person a telegram, I can communicate through sign language, through whatever language I want. I mean, I can communicate it through Klingon if the person I'm communicating with understands Klingon. I can send it through Morse code. I can send it through smoke signals. Whatever mechanism I want to would be effective if the person at the other end actually receives that information. Obviously, most of the time the offeror wants the contract, or excuse me, the offer to be communicated. Why else would you send it if you didn't want it to be received? And so usually you don't send it through smoke signals or some mechanism like that. You're going to send it typically in some written form or some oral form. So this is not usually a problem. But one can imagine circumstances in which it could be a problem. Imagine this. Imagine that Bob wants to make an offer to Larry. Bob doesn't know this about Larry, but Larry is deaf. He reads lips. Larry's very good at reading lips, and so you can have an extended conversation with Larry, and you wouldn't know that Larry was deaf, because as long as Larry is seeing your lips, he's able to understand the vast majority of what is being said. Larry didn't lose his hearing until he was an adult, so his speech pattern is typical of a hearing person. So Bob doesn't have any difficulty understanding Larry's spoken English. Larry has never shared with Bob that Larry is deaf. So Bob and Larry have had a discussion about something. There's a knock on the door, so Larry turns and goes to the door to answer the door. While Larry is walking to the door, Bob yells out an offer. Larry, I'll buy your car from you for $10,000. Larry continues to walk to the door because Larry hasn't heard Bob. Larry opens the door, someone comes in, and that maybe they have a conversation, and later on that person leaves. And Larry never responds to Bob's offer. Well, did Bob actually make an offer? Well, no, he didn't, because Larry, the offeree, didn't actually receive the communication because he's deaf. Let's imagine, let's put a little twist on this scenario. So while Larry is walking to answer the door, Bob yells, I'm willing to buy that car from you for $10,000. Larry opens the door, talks to the guest, the new guest for a second. The new guest leaves. Larry walks back and he says to Bob, Bob, I think that $10,000 for my car is a good price. What do you think? Well, it could be that Larry has Bob interprets Larry's comments to be an acceptance of Bob's offer. After all, Bob assumed that Larry heard his offer because Bob doesn't know that Larry's deaf. But in fact, from a legal standpoint, Larry didn't accept Bob's offer because Larry never heard it. He was unaware of the offer. Instead, Larry is making his own offer, which Bob is entitled to accept if he wants. Now, the scenario just presented is not a very likely one. A more likely scenario might be that Bob wants to email an offer to Larry, but Bob's email system auto-fills the address, and Bob actually knows two Larrys. One is Larry Brown, one is Larry Green. Bob more commonly emails Larry Brown, but in this particular case, Bob had wanted to correspond with Larry Green. Bob forgets about this autofill feature, and so when he starts typing in Larry Green, he just types in the first couple letters, it autofills to Larry Brown. Bob doesn't notice the problem. So he sends his offer to Larry Brown. He never realizes that Larry Green never got the offer to sell the car for $10,000. That would be an example of how Bob can think that he satisfied this third element of communicating it to the offeree, but in fact he did not. Now, we can see there's two ways that it can be communicated. One is directly to the offeree. A second is to communicate to the offeree's agent. A classic example of the second scenario is when you're buying a real property, maybe a home, maybe some land. Typically, if there are real estate agents being used, the buyer and the seller don't really communicate at all directly, they communicate to their agents. So if I'm the buyer of Bob's house, I'm not going to call up Bob and say, hey Bob, I'm willing to buy your house for $207,000. No, instead, I tell my real estate agent I want to extend an offer to Bob to buy his house for $207,000. Then my real estate agent communicates it to Bob's real estate agent. My client, Groover, is willing to buy Bob's property for $2,700,000. Then Bob's real estate agent says, Groover, through her agent, has informed me that she is willing to buy your land for $207,000. So communication to agents is as effective as if it had been told directly to the offeree himself or herself. And that's true even if the agent drops the ball and doesn't actually complete the deal. So imagine for a second that Bob's agent is in a terrible car accident after she hears about the offer, and she just forgets completely about it. She's injured and not really, maybe has a little bit of amnesia about it, and she never tells Bob about the offer. And under those circumstances, it still was an offer that I made, that Groover made, because it was communicated to the agent, even though the offeree, in this case Bob, never actually heard it. So now we have completed all of the three elements of the offer. We need to have all three of these elements in order to have an offer. We need to have an offer in order to have an agreement. We need to have an agreement in order to have a contract. Let's talk about ways that an offer can be terminated or revoked under these circumstances. There's actually 5 different paths for this that it can terminate. Now, we're not talking about a situation in which the offer is accepted. In some sense, an accepted offer transforms the offer from an offer to an agreement. So in some sense, you could say that, quote unquote, terminates the offer. But that's not what we're talking about here. When we say terminate an offer here, we mean the offer goes poof and there is no agreement. So we're going to look at the 5 ways. Again, this is when we'll see this throughout the next several chapters, that when you see lists like this, flag them, because it's very possible that you will see a test question that says, list the 5 ways that an offer can be terminated. Well, these are the 5 ways right here, so definitely worthy of your consideration. One way is that the offeror, and again we say the offeror is the person who makes the offer, can revoke the offer, can say, take back. The idea here is that the offeror is the master of his offer or her offer, and he or she can revoke it at any time. The offeror in contract law generally is about volunteers. It's about people who are choosing to enter into these relationships. Nobody is making them enter into these relationships. It is their own choice whether they enter into them or not, and they get to choose all the ins and outs of what the offer is going to be. So when we say the offeror is the master of his offer, he or she gets to pick exactly what is in the offer and gets to decide all of the ins and outs of that offer. This is exactly what the offeror wants. And so if he changes his mind and he thought he wanted to enter into this agreement, but you know what? This isn't working out for him, he can snatch it back. Now, he can't snatch it back after it's been accepted. Then it's too late. But up until the second of it being accepted, he can say, take backs, don't want to do that after all. Now, sometimes an offer sounds a little different than what we've been talking about. We haven't talked about a different kind of offer. Let me give you an example of the special kind that I'm talking about. Imagine, we'll go back to Larry and Bob's scenario. Larry owns the car dealership and Bob is the customer. Well, this time again, Bob doesn't have any difficulty telling the color. He knows he wants the seafoam green car. Larry is offering it for $15,000. Bob just isn't sure. He wants to kind of go to a few other car dealerships to see if it's the best deal for him. And so Larry says to Bob, you know what, Bob, I understand you want to shop around. I respect that. Just I'll leave this offer on the table open to you for 24 hours. It's 6 p.m. on Tuesday. This offer, $15,000 on this car, is good until 6 p.m. tomorrow. Shop around. I think you'll find this is the best deal in town for this particular type of car. I think you'll be back. And I think that we'll be able to conclude a deal. Bob says, sounds good. So Bob goes to several other car dealerships. He goes to some that night. He goes to some the next day. It's about 3 p.m. And you know what? Bob has concluded that Larry was right. $15,000 for this particular car is a good price, and that car is a good model. He hasn't been able to find anything as good for this price point. So at around 3:30, he rolls into the car dealership. He looks in the lot. He doesn't see a seafoam green car that he wants to make, or he wants to accept the offer of. It's missing. He finds Larry walking around the lot, and he goes, Larry, before anything else, Larry puts up his hands and says, I revoke my offer. I've already sold that sea green car to somebody else for $16,000. I was like, but you can't do that. You told me I had until 6 today. It's only 3:30. I have 2.5 more hours. You broke your promise. There he goes, you're right, I did. But I didn't break any contract. You and I didn't have a contract. I just extended an offer, and now I can revoke it whenever I want to. But Bob says, but you told me you would leave it open. Larry says, you're right. I was a jerk. I should have honored what I said, but I don't have a requirement to honor what I said under contract law. I don't have to keep the offer open. There is an exception to this right of the offeror to revoke at any time, even when he's made a promise, and that is an option contract. So let me show you how an option contract would work. Imagine that that in this scenario, Larry says the same thing. He says, Bob, you can have 24 hours to shop the market and see what you might be able to do in terms of a better price. And Bob goes, well, you know what, Larry? Thank you. I like that. I'd like for us to enter into an option contract, though, about this. So I'll tell you what, I will give you $5. And so this $5 will be like my earnest money. If it ends up that I come back within the 24 hours and I buy the car for $15,000. I'll only have to pay you $14,995. If I don't come back at all, or I come back and tell you I don't want the car, you can keep the $5. What do you think? Is that a fair deal? Larry goes, that sounds fair. I accept your option contract. I will keep this $5, and we'll use it against the purchase price if you buy, and I'll just keep the $5,000 if you don't. The $5 if you don't. So into this scenario, Bob does the same thing. He shops around, he looks around. He decides it around 3:30 or so, he decides he's going to go in and buy the car. He goes in and looks around. He can't find his car. He goes to Larry, goes, Larry, where's my car? Bob says, Larry says, Bob, before you say anything more, I revoke my offer. But Larry can't revoke because there's an option contract. Bob provided consideration for this deal. He gave the $5. So that means that he bought the right to keep that offer open for the 24 hours, whatever was provided for in the option contract. And so now Bob has the right to accept the offer, and now Larry is in breach because he can't provide Bob with that car because he sold it to somebody else. So that's how an option contract works. Here's the definition. An option contract is an agreement whereby the offeree, again the person who receives the offer, gives the offeror, the person who's making the offer, a piece of consideration, it might be very small, in exchange for the offeror's agreement to hold the offer open for a specified period of time. So because this has a consideration as a factor, that's what causes the offer to stay open. We'll talk about another category of option contracts or something similar to option contracts later on in the course, but this is the one we want to highlight right now. So the first way an offer can terminate is the offeror can change his mind, take back the offer, unless there's an option contract. Another way that an offer can be terminated is if the offeree rejects the offer. So let's imagine that Larry says to Bob, Bob, I'll sell you this car for $15,000. Bob says, nope, not interested. I'm willing to buy it for $13,000. Larry says, nope, not interested. Bob goes, well, okay, I am willing to buy it for $15,000 after all. Well, guess what? What Bob just said isn't an acceptance of Larry's offer of $15,000. Bob is making his own offer because as soon as he rejected Larry, he can't go back and say, I changed my mind. His saying he's willing to buy it at $15,000 is his own offer, which Larry is free to accept or reject as he sees appropriate. So a rejection kills the offer. Also, a counter offer kills the offer. So let's say that Larry says, Bob, I'm willing to sell you this car for $15,000. Bob says, Larry, thank you for that offer. I am willing to buy the car for $13,000. Larry says, nope, that's too low. I can't do that. And then Bob says, okay, well then we'll do it for $15,000. Well, guess what? Bob can't accept Larry's offer of $15,000 at this time because as soon as Bob made the counter offer, Larry's offer went away. Now, of course, Bob can offer the $15,000 himself, and very likely Larry will say, okay, I'm still willing to do the deal for that price point. But Larry is not required to do that. Another way to terminate an offer is for the offeror to die or be incapacitated. Now keep in mind this only works when it's an offer outstanding. Once there's actually an agreement, the death of one of the parties does not typically, there's some exceptions, but does not usually cause the whole contract to go poof. The contract is still in force, so it's only when we have an unaccepted offer that the death or incapacity of the offeror causes the offer to go poof. Another situation in which the offer terminates is when there's destruction or subsequent illegality of the offer. So let's say that as Bob and Larry are discussing buying the car, a lightning bolt hits that car and incinerates it. I mean, it's just a few, hubcaps and burnt and twisted metal. There's nothing there that's a car at that point. Well, guess what? It doesn't matter whether Bob and Larry are aware of the fact that the car has been destroyed. The destruction of the car has also destroyed the offer. Equally, subsequent illegality of the offer makes it a contract, no longer a contract. Again, we have that legal object requirement. So really, under this scenario, our offer is going to fail for two reasons. One is it's no longer an offer, but also the contract, if we allowed it to be a contract, would have no legal object. An example of something that could become subsequently illegal is, imagine that a beer distributor went on a college campus and said to the students, hey, we're willing to sell you kegs of beer. We'll deliver them to your dorm rooms. In this particular state, the lawful drinking age is 18. So virtually all the students at this college are eligible to drink lawfully. So this contract would be a lawful contract. They have this offer outstanding, but the legislature in this particular state is in session, and they actually pass a law that raises the drinking age to 25. Well, as a result of this change, virtually none of the students in this dormitory are of lawful age to drink. Because they are too young to buy alcohol, that offer went poof at the second that this legislature made the requirement that people be 25 before they can buy kegs of beer. And so therefore, the offer went poof at that time. The fifth way that an offer terminates is when there's a lapse of time to the offer. Let's say that, going back to the example, I have a bakery and I'm trying to sell a pecan pie. Well, guess what? A pecan pie is good for a few days, but after several days, the crust gets stale. It's just no longer good. Eventually, it'll probably get moldy and, the ants will get in or something like that. No one wants a pecan pie that's a year old, right? So the lapse of time can cause the offer to go away. And of course, this depends upon what's reasonable under the circumstances. And it's going to depend upon what the offer is about. So a loaf of bread or pecan pie is going to have a relatively short period of time. If it's an offer to buy some land out in the country, that offer might be good for even a few years if it's a very illiquid asset. So it depends upon the circumstances, what is a reasonable period of time or not. Another way an offer can terminate is when there's a failure of some type of consideration. Let's say I have an offer in which I say, I will sell you this land if Drusilla is elected to the city council. Well, Drusilla does not win the election. Well, as soon as it's announced that Horace won the election instead of Drusilla, that offer went poof because a condition that was associated with the offer didn't happen. So these are the 5 ways that we can terminate an offer. And again, this assumes that the offer has not been accepted. If the offer has been accepted, these things would not necessarily terminate the agreement that exists. So at this point, we've talked about, or we've kind of done half of our discussion of agreement. We've talked about the offer portion of agreement. Next, we'll be talking about the acceptance part of the agreement. At this point, I'm going to end this particular presentation. Please look at the next presentation for, please go to the next presentation for a more detailed examination of the issue of acceptance, and also a more complete discussion of our introduction to contracts. Thanks for your attention. As always, if you have questions about a topic that we're covering, please feel free to email me, come to my office hours, or raise those questions in class. Thanks again. Bye-bye.